Hello and welcome to Diving into the Discourse, CSUN Conversation podcast where we talk to faculty and staff about their research projects, areas of expertise, and how their field affects students. I'm your host, Matthew Bragulla. With me is my co-host, Carmen Ramos Chandler. And today we are with Dr. Melissa Wall. She is a professor at the Department of Journalism, as well as the advisor for the Mass Communications graduate program. She is specialized in international journalism and online media, and today we will be talking about the changing media landscape and how it's influencing election media coverage and how Americans view and receive election news. Melissa Wall, thank you for coming in today, talking with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Now, I wanted to ask, because this election was quite a unique one where we saw both candidates use different forms of media like we've never seen before, especially new media where we're talking about TikTok and even podcasts. What do you think, in your opinion, kind of influenced this? And do you think we're going to see more of this in future elections?
Well, there were some new things in this election, but for me, for somebody who's looked at media across a long period, there are patterns across time in terms of political coverage. And political coverage is kind of a special beat in the U.S. for journalists that has evolved over the years, but there are elements of it that have stayed the same. And I kind of want to, if you don't mind, I'd like to back up into this because I think it's important to look at it. And the place I like to start is in the 1970s, because that's when you get the sense they've covered elections all along, but there's something changes in terms of the journalists, the way certain journalists are talking about elections. And it happens after the 1972 election between Richard Nixon and George McGovern. You get these younger journalists who are looking at things quite a bit differently than the typical core of journalists who sort of kind of reflected a similar outlook on the election in elections past. There's not that much of a difference. And what happens is you get these two guys in particular that are very influential who write books that come out the next year. One of them is Timothy Krause, who writes The Boys on the Bus. The other one is a guy named Hunter S. Thompson, who writes Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. I don't know, Matt, if you've ever come across these books.
I think I've come across Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail for sure. Hunter S. Thompson. I haven't read all of it, admittedly, but I know that's like one of the big kind of examples of just analyzing, for sure, this new era of election coverage. It
is both an analysis, but it's given, the work is given in this irreverent tone of, oh, look at these idiot politicians, this evil Nixon, and Hunter S. Thompson was a journalist who was on drugs half the time when he was covering these stories. He shows up drunk. He's doing all these crazy things. He's kind of breaking all the rules, and all these kind of mainstream journalists are aghast at what he is doing. And this crazy man is doing things, but he's actually telling us what's happening instead of kind of normalizing it and saying, oh, yeah, these two guys are running for president. He's saying, no, this guy's a criminal. This Nixon, it's crazy. We have a war. We have all these things happening in the country. The other guy, Timothy Krause, is a very young guy, and so The Boys on the Bus is about the experience of being a reporter covering a campaign. And it is all boys. It's all men covering this, and they're all in this tight kind of literally physical space together of a bus, going along with the candidate and covering the story. And he starts to realize, well, they're all kind of doing the same thing. And they come up with this term, pack journalism. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's where the journalists are acting like a group of, really like a group of dogs or something. They're all acting in unison in a pack they're asking the same questions. They're kind of getting the same angles. They're not branching out and saying anything different. So he identifies these patterns, and this book comes out, and it's widely read and influential. And what they both did was kind of pull back the curtain on coverage of political activities in the U.S. in terms of campaigns. And it really opened the eyes of a lot of up and coming journalists to, this is what it's like. So that's why I like to start there, because yes, and today people will talk about, everything's so different. They're doing things they haven't done before. But this pattern of doing something different isn't all that new. The other thing I did want to just briefly touch on too historically, and then we're going to jump into the digital age, which is in the 1980s, then you get the rise of CNN. And so you're getting cable news coverage. And cable news coverage means they're going to have news all the time. So they're kind of covering things all the time. So you're ending up creating news for cable to be able to cover. And the person who wrote about this is actually a Californian, about being on the campaign trail in 1988, and that's Joan Didion, a very famous essayist. And she writes this piece about being on the campaign trail with Michael Dukakis, who's running against George Bush Sr. And they're pulling up in a plane on a tarmac, and there's the scene she describes where Dukakis gets out and starts throwing a baseball. He has a baseball mitt with some other guy who's on the campaign, and they're rolling the cameras and filming this. So it's just a made-up thing to try to convey something about him. And so again, it's this thing of that what we're seeing in these campaigns, it's all concocted for our benefit to see. And what these reporters, like these outsider reporters, are trying to tell us is this isn't some real thing, that it's for us. It's a performance.
It's for their image to project to the public.
And it's a performance in the way that we now see they're performing all the time, and the way Trump performs all the time. That's not new. People have been performing all along. It's just it's gotten much more exaggerated, I think, in my opinion. And Didion talked about narrative fidelity, which is this idea that what you do as the candidate has to make sense. It has to fit into your story. And Dukakis didn't understand this. And so there's a famous image of him where he jumps into a tank, and he's popping out of a tank showing I'm a tough guy, I'm like a soldier, and he looks like a geek. He looks stupid. And people laugh and make fun of him. It wasn't in his narrative. That's not his narrative. You have to have the right narrative. Like Reagan was a cowboy who cut wood and all this stuff in California. So you're trying to get narrative fidelity. This is also applicable to what's happened in the most recent election. Is the narrative fidelity can be very powerful. And so I just want to kind of establish these patterns that are not all that new. And then we get into the 2000s, it's digital media. And I think probably the most meaningful election in terms of understanding media in a different way was Obama, where the Obama team was said to have really kind of mastered what existed as social media then. So you're talking like 2008. YouTube would have existed. There was blogging, but I think maybe Twitter starts in 2008. Anyway, we're in this very beginnings of social media. And a very famous thing happens with Obama. So the Obama team's trying to use all this stuff, and they're believed to have used it very effectively. But he is out on the campaign trail, and this random woman named Mayhill Fowler comes up and asks him a question about Western Pennsylvania, which we've heard a lot about Pennsylvania in this most recent election, about who lives there, what they believe, et cetera, et cetera. And Obama says something along the lines of, well, those people, they cling to their God, their guns, and what was the other thing? Oh, now I'm not going to remember it. God, guns, and something else. Anyway, he says this thing, and he gets blown out of proportion, and everybody's like, oh, my God, he said this terrible thing or whatever. The only reason anybody knows that he said it was because this woman asked and got this thing and posted it on a blog somewhere. And what that did was open up what you were doing as a candidate. It means that anybody anywhere could show up and they might get inside somewhere you're at a rally or whatever on the line, ask a question and post it online and people would hear about it. In years past, nobody would have ever heard anything anybody ask you. So suddenly you're in this position where both you can reach out in all these new ways, but you are also now on guard.
You're under a 1,000 microscopes.
Yes. Some of them become pull back and they're like, oh, we've got to be super careful. We've got to manage this even more than we used to because anything could get you into trouble. And so you have these contradictory things that have come about because of digital comms of, oh, I can get my message out in all these different places and all these different people are going to amplify it. They're going to personalize it and share it with family and friends. But also anybody could be watching me at any time. And in fact, campaigns they send people around to, oh, you're the guy I'm running against. I'm going to send my people to watch you constantly and get something on the phone now, and then they can post that. So those are kind of two things that change what happens is that sort of personal thing. And so I think that if you look at what happened in 2024, everything I've talked about kind of plays out in different similar ways.
Mm-hmm. But when you have a candidate like Donald Trump, who's very inflammatory, very exaggerated, doesn't seem to have any, I guess, concern for what he's saying. He's very out there upfront with it. Is that a concern for him even when, maybe someone on the other team's like, okay, let me record you saying something. Does he even care?
Well, with him, that he will say or do anything, that's his narrative.
Sure.
And narrative fidelity means he can always say or do anything. And people think he's real. He's being real.
I'm very curious because it's very interesting to buy into the narrative fidelity. Trump's image, President Trump's image, is outrageousness. Very much outrageousness. And then when you would go to the individual voters, not the one who stood in line for 16 hours to see him at the rally, and you go through his agenda, oh, he's not really going to do it. It's just performance because his narrative is performance. Bigger than life. Bombastic, very much, I'm a real guy, even though, I'm worth billions of dollars and I've never actually, swept the floor. Do you think that conflict between that narrative once you will get elected to office and your media, what I'm finding now is members of the news media, regardless of whether you're in the new media or the traditional media, if you reveal that there's a conflict between what you think he's going to do and the reality of what he does, they blame the messenger.
He gets cut a break. Well, he gets cut a break by a lot of his supporters and by the media.
Yeah.
The term they use for Trump is from professional wrestling called kayfabe. Kayfabe, I think, is the term. Have you heard this term? Everybody knows it's fake.
Mm-hmm.
When you see professional wrestling and throw to the ground, it's fake, it's fake, it's fake. So I think for the supporters, and I'm not one of those people, but they cut him a break. They think that the narrative fidelity is, well, he'll have to make some compromises, but we trust him. And I think it plays into this idea that a lot of people don't. There are people that are like journalists, professors, people like that, very interested in politics, following everything going on. But most people don't want to follow everything going on. We elected him. Remember one of his slogans, it appeared everywhere he went, Trump will fix it. He said he would fix it. I'm not going to worry about it. He's going to fix it. He has a little bit of an opening Achilles heel here right now, though, because of this alignment with the oligarchs, the billionaires. And that doesn't fit exactly with his narrative in terms of I'm the voice, I'm your defender, I'm your voice. He's got to now convince his followers that aligning with them is somehow helping them. I mean, it does play into an very strange Americanism of people like very rich business people and think that they know how to fix things, even though they generally, and some of them do, but some of them run businesses into the ground. But there's this kind of love of, and we've had this in politics for a long time, let's elect a businessman. He knows how to run things, but running a business isn't the same as running a government. So I think if he starts to not deliver the kinds of things people expected, then you're going to get some of there's the hardcore voters, they will just go with him no matter what. But the other ones, if they're made aware of that he's not actually delivering, then they could turn on him.
I'm going to interrupt Matthew one more time. I'm of a certain age. So when growing up, 6 o'clock news was on at dinner. You sat down and you had Walter Cronkite or Harry Reasoner or whoever it was, what national news, and we had a common town square, common town crier. Remember, the town crier told the news centuries and centuries and centuries ago. If you couldn't afford in the LA Times a subscription to the LA Times or a subscription to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, it didn't make a difference. You had Walter Cronkite who was going to tell you, and you trusted him because he wasn't biased, he wasn't partisan in any way. We don't have that anymore. American families don't sit around at dinner and turn on CBS, NBC, ABC, or even CNN and watch dinner together and have a sort of interesting discussion at the dinner table. We don't even get our news. He'll get his news different from where I get my news. How do journalists who are enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, in the very First Amendment, their role was so pivotal to the founding of this country, so pivotal, according to our founding fathers, for the future of this country, that they put press in the First Amendment. What is the press now? Who is the press? And how do they determine? I mean, Joe Rogan helped elect Donald Trump. He's a comedian with a talk show. Jon Stewart and The Daily Show was a comedy show, yet so many Americans get their news from comedians. That's news. They're not journalists. Of course, one was a journalist and is now a comedian, but that's Ron Wood Jr., his father was a journalist, and he was a journalist, and then he got into comedy. So that's one person I'll respect, because he knows how to ask questions and gather information and do research. But none of these people have any training.
Well, it's complicated. And it's true. It's actually, to my mind, it's quite dangerous that we don't have a shared narrative. We don't, and if it is an explanation for why when you talk to people, they say all these things and you think, that's crazy. How could you think that? It's because they're getting their information from somewhere completely different and it seems legitimate to them. And you're getting your information over here, they're getting their and they're two different spheres that don't even overlap in many cases. So it's super dangerous because we're getting to this point where we live in two different worlds and yet we're side by side. We're neighbors, we're in the grocery stores together or whatever. So it's a problem. And it's not just limited to our country. And it's also reflective of the collapse of the traditional mainstream journalism institutions is simply another collapse of institutions themselves. We are seeing the collapse of institutions. And the replacement in the journalism world is the individual influencer or podcaster or whatever. And this is, to my mind, a problem. I mean, we're seeing the collapse of the churches, of government, of the press. So all of these things people don't believe or trust. And when you don't believe and trust in any of the institutions, you're going to have a collapse of the government. That's just inevitable historically. So what is a journalist? Well, this is the question that came up when we started with blogging in the early 2000s is, well, those people aren't journalists. So what is a journalist? And then you try to define a journalist. And we tend to define the journalist by their practices. They collect the information, they verify the information, they deliver it to people. And so that meant that citizens could be journalists too. But we didn't include in there anything to do with institutions. And I've come to believe that for a lot of journalism, you need to be connected to an institution for practical reasons, but partly also for protection, so that people know that you're really a journalist, that there's somewhere to go and say, "This, your journalist didn't tell us the right thing," or whatever. But if you're just one person, it's not the same thing. I know I have disagreement with students. They think it's the same thing. Well, they won't listen to the influencer. But I don't think that's right. And I also think the institutional power of the New York Times, whether you hate the New York Times or not, if you don't have that institutional power backing you up, you can be sued at any moment. You can be harassed. You can be jailed. You need to have some kind of institution protecting you in some way. And I think that the degrading of the institution is quite dangerous as well. But if the institutions, as we're seeing, all kind of give up and give in, then where are we then? We're really screwed.
That was my question too. Is the capitulation? Now, as someone who was in the journalism business beginning at age 15. Regardless of how I felt about the publication, whether I thought it was conservative or thought it was too left, so many of the non-corporations, but the individuals who owned the media enterprises at that time often did so because they felt they needed to give back to the community, that they were playing, even though they may have manipulated an opinion here or there to favor a business practice in some way or another because their friend was running for mayor or sheriff or whatever. But they felt a responsibility to the community and were passionate about, we need to cover what's going on in that town hall and that city hall because it impacts the community and we care about the community. When you're owned by a hedge fund, what are your ties to that community and the business that serves that community and provides it with news? That's my question. So
you have no responsibility. Your responsibility is to make money. It's the same thing whether, they own hospitals now too. They don't care if everybody dies. They just want to get their money and take it and leave the shell of whatever that business was. And this is you see this most direly in what are called, this term, news deserts all around the country, where all these newspapers, they're shutting down everywhere, but especially when you get outside the cities, they're gone. There is no news media. So how do you know what's happening? There used to be the guy or the family that ran the local paper, and they go to the school board and the city council and do all, what happened to the police or whatever. And so you would go, and they weren't making things up. They may have had a slant towards the business community or whatever, or maybe favored their own business. But you pretty much trusted them, and they were there covering things, and that's gone. And what's happened, all those people have gone, they talk about the news has become nationalized. So where they're going to get their news now is onto social media. If they're older, it's Facebook. And they're getting all caught up in something happening nationally and not paying attention to what happens locally, which is super important, what's happening in your own community. And they've done studies that those news deserts, the people in those news deserts often are the people who turn to Donald Trump and they support him. They're not getting any information that would be critical of him. They're just seeing this national news and he's up there saying, I'm going to fix it. And they're like, okay, this guy's going to fix it. But it's a huge problem, the lack of media in all these small communities, that it's disappeared.
I think I've seen evidence in some of the conversations for instance, we now are in the midst, and this is January, people, whenever this runs, of mass rounding up of allegedly undocumented immigrants and them being deported. I can't tell you the number of interviews I saw, regardless of the network, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, or the local affiliate, who the Trump supporters were convinced, they're not going to touch. These are hardworking people. The immigrants make a difference. They make my business thrive. He's only going after the criminals. It is January 28th, 2025, and there's fruit rotting on the vines in various states because there are no migrants to pick the produce. So you're right about not paying attention to the local news, because the local person who builds a reputation of covering City Hall and and maybe it's agricultural board, and they cover the agriculture board, and see, it's in our local paper, they might have been more aware of the impact of a decision.
I think that it's this kind of magical thinking that, oh, when Trump says this, he doesn't really mean it. He just needs to scare people. The same way in his international affairs or whatever, he just needs to be tough and scare people, and then that'll fix the problem. He's not going to do the really bad things. I think there's just this belief in him. I think he is a singular figure in that regard. I don't know that what comes after him will be the same, but I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen.
I wonder if people kind of got more encouraged in that idea that, oh, he just needs to scare him after, let's say, I guess, during the 2016 to 2020 presidency, the whole North Korea, how it's like, oh, I guess he's scared that eventually now we're actually, in talks with North Korea. It's like, wow, what a success. And then, a few months later, I guess nothing happened. And so I wonder if that's kind of like an example of just like, okay.
Nothing has changed in our relationship with North Korea. That was just a performance. And that's what he does, is he bullies, he threats, he performs, and maybe he gets an outcome or maybe he doesn't. It just depends on the situation. To go to this issue of why do these people not believe he was going to round them up? It is, again, it's the separation of spheres of where people are getting information. And the other place that people are getting their information is in closed spaces like WhatsApp or whatever it is they're in, these messaging apps. And they're in there with family, friends, or whatever. I did some a lot of field work with refugees, and you would find, on the one hand, they knew a lot of things and they had all this information, but news we get, some kind of information we get inside the sphere, and they especially had to be with, in the same way with migrants and people like that, you're going to be with people you trust, and that some piece of information would get in there and it was wrong. And they would all believe it. And you couldn't move them away from that because it had come from a trusted source. So there's both what's happening on Newsmax or Fox or whatever, but I don't know how many of these people are even watching any of that anymore. It's what's going on social media and what's happening in your own personal information spheres.
I'm going to build on this and back to the journalist. One is, what was your gut instinct as a career journalist when Trump, during some of his campaigns, basically called for assault on journalists and then called into question the integrity of, particularly, of female journalists of color?
It's horrifying and disgusting, but very concerning. I mean, this is something you see in these countries where and I've been in countries and I've interviewed journalists where they've been in jail, they've been put into some holding pen with 100 other people and not enough room to lay down just because they wrote something nobody wanted. Or they showed up when something bad happened somewhere and the police said, and they said, how many people are in the hospital? And the police said, well, we're going to arrest you if you keep asking that question. It brought to mind these other countries where these things happen. So on the one hand, I couldn't believe it was happening here. But on the other hand, it was not something I've never heard of or seen before. It's just not in the context of here. The journalist stood up. I think that we could do a better job of standing up and fighting back. I mean, you've seen with this most recently, these news companies just capitulating and settling these suits. I mean, what was one of the suits was with CNN, and they said, oh, you gave Kamala Harris the questions ahead of time. It was something crazy that could never, in a court of law.
60 minutes.
Yeah, 60 minutes. You can never, how would you win that in a court of law? And they just went ahead and said, yeah, you're right. I mean, in these other cases, they're not even fighting back, which tells you either they think the system is so corrupt that they can't win the case, or they're so interested in pleasing him and holding on to whatever else their business is involved in, because these businesses aren't just about news. That's just some part of some larger entity.
They see it as like in the long form, like, all right, we need to keep making money. Like we need to survive.
Well, we need to keep making money. And that is the heart of the problem of a lot of the lack of pushback is I want my spaceship program to stay up. So I don't really care if the Washington Post goes down.
Did you have another question? Because I always have tons of questions.
Oh, no, yeah. I kind of wanted to go back to something you had mentioned earlier about how the public is turning to comedians, podcasters for their election news or just kind of opinions on just the political landscape in general.
You mean like the transition of news sources?
Yeah, well, I'm literally seeing because I watch either The Daily Show and I mean, when the Donald Trump episode on Joe Rogan dropped, I'm like, I have to like see like is like what's going on here. Like this is not what I didn't see it coming. I guess I kind of saw it coming, but it's still, I guess, a very big moment at least for podcasts. And so what I've seen on both sides, like in the comments, people are saying like, there are people commenting saying like, I trust comedians. This is the age of time where comedians are more trustworthy to get, your news, to get your facts, I guess. And I actually looked at the comments for the Joe Rogan, Donald Trump episode, because I thought it'd be interesting to read the comments. And what I think the most liked comment was, podcasts are officially more important than traditional media. And obviously, a Joe Rogan viewer doesn't speak for the entirety of American public, but I think that's a very interesting, and it had hundreds of thousands of likes. And I think that's such an interesting shift in how, I guess, the public views the news. Like at this point, like, do you think, might be a hard question, but is traditional journalism like with covering that, is it dying? Is it at like such a all-time low right now?
I think it is in serious trouble. And I think Joe Rogan has a much larger audience than a lot of these news outlets. Many, many more people are paying attention to what he says than are paying attention to a lot of what their newspapers or news channels or whatever. I mean, there's two different things. You've talked about the entertainment part, and that's one thing, and that kind of grows out of a long kind of evolution from television news, which became more and more like entertainment. And you had these anchors, and they're yakking it up and whatever, and getting farther and farther away from like serious, the Walter Cronkite kind of news. So that's a long-term pattern that it doesn't take that much of a shift to then go into Jon Stewart or whoever reading the news, but doing it with a humorous take. If you're not doing any reporting, what's the difference between one thing or the other? But the issue with with a lot of the podcasters and whatever is what reporting are they doing? What reporting are they doing?
All I could tell was that.
Are they just asking a source a question? That is a form of reporting,
Sure.
But I'm talking about finding out what's really happening somewhere, like going into somewhere that's quiet. If you're a foreign correspondent, somewhere dangerous, into a war zone and trying to figure out, did people really get murdered here? Where are the bodies? Or looking into somebody who can read the spreadsheets and do do this kind of investigative work where they're figuring out, wait, there's something wrong here. Mm-hmm. That's very different. That's a highly specialized skill, and you have to be very well trained to do that. That's why there's not that many people who can do that. It's very expensive for journalism outlets to fund that versus I'm going to talk to somebody. I mean, I'm not saying it's not bad. Talk to somebody, of course. Let's ask this important person some questions.
Sure.
But also, it seems like a lot of times when they're being asked these questions, there's no pushback. Mm-hmm. Just letting somebody talk, turning and not ever saying, but wait a minute. You just made this terrible decision. You made this decision, and a whole bunch of people suffered. And kind of why? Why did you do that? What was the purpose of that? What's going on here? And so I think there's a difference between talking to a source and actually going out and investigating a story.
Well, it's interesting because one of the other comments was like, this should be required for all candidates, just unedited, uncensored talking to the person. And I mean, I mean, I'm not going to say it's inherently invaluable, but I don't know if that's like it. Like you said, there's not really a pushback. They're just asking them questions. And I'm sure, whether it be Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Kamala Harris, I would think they would have prepared for certain questions to be asked. And they have Donald Trump has his slogans and like his ways to wind, his stories back to what he wants to say. So,
well, I think that people say that because they know these politicians are so managed and so controlled in what they say. And they have reasons to, especially I think if you're a person of color or a woman, that these expectations are that you're going to, there's so many expectations that they get constrained more and more in what they are going to say. Whereas if you're Trump, we know his narrative is I'll say anything and he's not going to suffer for it. It doesn't matter. He can contradict himself. He can say something crazy, something offensive. There's no punishment for it. So if you're like that, then you feel very constrained in saying whatever you want. If you look at politicians and like in Britain and places, and even in Canada or wherever, these other countries, they are much more open with the media. They go out and they spar and they talk and they know the issues. And we elect people that often don't know anything about the issues. They're elected because they look good or they had a bunch of money or whatever.
They played football?
Yeah, they played football. We don't elect them because they know a lot.
If you ask them what lobbying is, will you get an answer?
Well, this bill that you just passed, what does it do? And why did you support it? And what about this part of it? And they wouldn't know.
What are the ramifications? Like, what do they all entail? Like, are there loopholes? Yeah.
So I actually wrote a paper a while back with a colleague, and it was about comparing the U.S. and the British media in terms of how they handle politicians. And the British media is much more in their face, and but you did this, and they don't let them sneak away and have go off on some sideshow and da-da-da-da-da-da. And it makes you feel more like, okay, this person's being held to account, and they actually know what they're talking about. And sometimes it's quite impressive. Because our people, when they talk about the issues, are often sound quite uninformed. Is the nicest thing I can think of to say.
Yeah.
Do you think part of this pushback lies in? I remember since the age of 8 years old, all I wanted to be was a journalist. That's all I wanted to be. I was still in high school when Ronald Reagan was president. And he was going after welfare queens. Now, I grew up on welfare. And what struck me was welfare woman, she's a black woman with kids, and she's driving a gold Cadillac. I didn't see a gold Cadillac in my neighborhood. I didn't see food in my refrigerator at the end of the month when food stamps, yes, it was food stamps, it wasn't a debit card, at the end of the month. We were on welfare. But no one in that journalist pool had that lived experience in which to ask him, excuse me, who are you talking about? Because everyone I know who receives public assistance does not have that experience. So can you provide me with the data to back up your claim? Now, I'm married to a prosecutor who prosecutes Medi-Cal fraud in the state of California. And he will tell you of Medi-Cal fraud, 98+% of it, it's committed by the providers, by the dentists and the doctors and the nursing home owners and the medical supply company owners, not by the recipients. So again, do you think it's that lived experience adding to the discussion? So if I was someone who might be interested in the news, but I see an idiot asking, not challenging the President of the United States, and I was poor, why am I going to watch you? I don't trust you. I'm going to turn off because you don't represent me. Do you think that part of it is, too, it's the journalists have become so insular, part of that community, that those who ask the hard questions, or it's like in some place in Colorado, the journalist in Colorado who took on, I get her name wrong because I want to call Lorena Bobbitt.
Not her.
But you know what I'm saying? He took her on and asked her tough questions. Now, she still got reelected, but he still asked the uncomfortable questions.
Lauren Boebert.
That's right. So why do you think those who are covering at the national level have become so insular and so happy to be part of the same crowd that they've forgotten to ask about the cost of eggs, which apparently the median price is $12 for a dozen? So a dollar an egg for a dozen?
Well, I think it's a combination of things, and I think it goes back to this idea of the pack. Mm-hmm. You both get who gets these jobs. There's a lot of people who come out of Northeastern private expensive universities, the Ivy Leagues or whatever. They get the top jobs. Mm-hmm. And there were studies of this in terms of international reporting, who got sent to these places, not somebody who had a connection or spoke the language, although that's changed. But a lot of those people get the top jobs, and they're the kind of face of journalism. But they're also connected in some way. They all live in certain cities, and they all go to the same coffee shops, and so everybody's very connected. You could still get in. We have people from our program who come from very modest, difficult backgrounds who've gotten to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or whatever. Yeah, I mean, they do get in. But I think if you want to stay in there, and especially when we're talking about political reporting, it's a special kind of reporting, a special group of people. And what they see today is, oh, I need access because after this is over, I want to write a book, and I'm going to get a big book contract, and I might get a podcast. And, the woman who covered Hillary Clinton got a streaming show, fictionalized streaming show on, I don't know, was it Hulu or whatever, about her life, based on her life. So there's a lot of rewards for not challenging, because if you're the one challenging and nobody else is challenging, then, as you know, the editor's going to be like, well, nobody else thought that. Why are you asking that? There's this idea of, you don't want to stand out. So, and the other part of, I think, the Republicans' concerns are very good. I think they have shops that do this. They create these phrases, these catchphrases that work in people's brains that just tap into something. The gold Cadillac, the fact that you can even still remember the gold Cadillac, what does that tell us? It means it was something about that term that stuck in people's heads. And they come up with these terms. And as a journalist, you're taking in all this information and like, oh, that's so much easier to say. I'll just say gold Cadillac and, the quote there, and not try to figure this out for myself. I have a limited amount of time. So there's several things happening at once. The promise of something bigger coming along. You don't want to get punished or demoted or sent out to some bureau or whatever. And the fact that they're making it easy for you. And the narrative they have, and partly we saw this with this election, it's spread across their media. It's the same narrative, so it seems to be the reality. Whereas in our in kind of traditional media, they don't cooperate to spread a narrative. They may do it inadvertently, but it's a different dynamic.
It's almost like commonly accepted term. It's almost like commonly accepted thread, and I don't have the time. I'll use a prime example. I used to work for the Los Angeles Daily News, which is now part of the Southern California News Group. At its peak, when I was there, it had 229 people in editorial, just as Los Angeles Daily News. Do you know how many people work at Los Angeles Daily News? The Daily News. In 30 years, we went from 229 contenders for Pulitzers because of its reporting
to 2.
So how can you do the depth of hard work that may or may not pay off in the end to find the facts to question?
You can't. There's not enough people doing it. There's not enough people watching. Ordinary citizens can't be that. They don't have time. I used to study citizen journalism, and most people don't want to be a citizen journalist. Mm-hmm. They don't want to go out and investigate and do it. They don't have time. And if they do, there's usually kind of something about them that's a little off.
It seems like a lot of the big examples of citizen journalists, at least when I was taking, my classes, we had to learn about like citizen journalism, and it was kind of this argument like, are they legitimately journalists or not? Because maybe they're not following the certain structure, the certain like moral codes that journalists are taught, and it seems like a lot of it kind of almost happens on accident. But then, I mean,
It's accidental journalism is what it is. It's you,
But then it
there's a flood, there's a fire, and you get a
popular.
video and you post it, but does that make you a journalist? I think it makes you a witness. You're a and journalists are witnesses too, but they do a whole lot more than just grab the video. They're also trying to help you make sense of it.
And it may just be a result of just how our new technology works and algorithms and stuff, but it seems to become like more popular than, or it blows up. Like that's what makes it so popular, I guess, citizen journalism.
Well, you don't know why it blows up because we look who's controlling the social media. They're manipulating the algorithms. I mean, maybe it's super popular, but maybe somebody somewhere has decided, we're going to boost this. I think this is something I want out there for whatever reason.
They start boosting certain, material to certain people, and that's how they trap them in these alternative news, I guess, rabbit holes.
Oh, well, we know this, that the more you look at some type of content, the more they're going to feed you. This is how they've radicalized people, is it just keeps getting more and more violent or whatever. They drag you down. Oh, I'm going to feed, the algorithm keeps feeding you more and more because they don't want you to go
how well it works.
Yeah.
I mean, just from a personal experience, I remember I had a family member who I think it was the instance of Donald Trump, that first assassination attempt where it hit his ear. I mean, a bizarre and just insane day within itself. And just this family member came to me like, I think the next day, I guess they had just been reading article after article, video after video after video.
Were they article or were they?
I'm trying to remember. I think they were articles, but then again, I don't know what the articles were. Which articles
were they created by humans or AI?
Yeah, that's a whole other issue too.